Loved your speech, John. It was very nice.
Oh, thank you. Change it. I didn't give it to him.
He's good. I hate it.
I heard you were amazing this afternoon.
No, I'm not like that. And that's just, you can do stuff all you can, but I couldn't do it. It's kind of what I was writing.
sound check. One, two. Question share number 5. I'm going to play it on four. One, two, ready, and go.
Please join me. Let's thank them again, please. Good evening and welcome. My name is Randy Hollerith, and I'm the Dean of Washington National Cathedral. And on behalf of Mary Ann Buddy, the Bishop of the Diocese of Washington, and all of us who serve this cathedral, we are so glad to have you with us and to have all those joining us online. I think we have close to 1,500 folks who have registered online to be with us tonight. And so we welcome you from around the country and indeed perhaps around the world. Thank you all for being with us. In particular, I want to thank our partners in this endeavor, this wonderful afternoon and evening, Sara Bloomfield and her colleagues at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They have been wonderful partners to work with. And I want to thank Elisha and Marian Wiesel and the staff of the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity. Thank you for walking with us in this and being so supportive. It has meant the world. The cathedral's canon historian and all the members of tonight's panel, I want to thank you ahead of time for sharing your wisdom with us and for being available for this conversation. Finally, I want to recognize our head stonemason, Joe Alonzo, the artist and sculptor Chaz Fagan, who designed the bust of Elie Wiesel in the cathedral, and our brilliant stone carver, Sean Callahan, who actually took a block of granite that was built into this cathedral and extended from the wall, a rectangular block of limestone, and formed that beautiful relief of Elie Wiesel in that rock. So Sean and Joe, would you all stand up and be recognized, please? Unfortunately, Chaz Fagan couldn't be with us tonight, but we're very grateful for the gift of his talents. My friends, we gather this evening in the shadow of a giant of humanity and human rights, a giant of faith and a towering moral presence in the face of immense suffering. Elie Wiesel was a gift to the whole human family, and we thank God for his life, for his example, and most importantly, the challenge he gave to each of us. I would like to take just a few minutes to talk about why the man that brings us here tonight, Elie Wiesel, is here in this Christian house of worship, and why that carving has been added to the fabric of this cathedral. When the opportunity was presented to add the final figure in the human rights porch, to round out this quartet of carvings, there were any number of people who deserved to be chosen. But in my mind, there was really no other choice than Elie Wiesel. First, as you may know, Elie was a person of immense and deep faith. In the darkest hours of his sufferings, in the midst of the Holocaust, as he watched the flames that murdered his God and murdered his soul, as he wrote in Night, moments that he said consumed his faith forever, Elie Wiesel kept on praying in spite of it all. Like the biblical patriarch Jacob, he wrestled with God, angry that God could allow the presence of such evil, suing God for his absence, but never letting go of God. During that horrific suffering, Elie Wiesel never let go of his faith, either his faith in God or his faith in humanity. I want to be clear that Elie Wiesel was not added to this cathedral in spite of his Jewish faith, but because of it. His global activism was rooted in and fueled by his belief in a just and merciful God. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, thou art with me, the psalmist reminds us. Wiesel walked through the darkest valleys with God, and he is a powerful example to teach each of us what it means to fight for hope in the midst of despair. Finally, Elie Wiesel's challenge to us is as ageless and timeless as the God he served. When you look across human history, so many of our brightest lights seem to dim with age and time, but not Elie Wiesel. Even now, he is the voice of the world's moral conscience in many ways, challenging us to never overlook the plight of the most vulnerable, to guard against the temptation of indifference, to never deny the image of God in the faces of our neighbors, and yes, even our enemies. There is no voice that is stronger for justice, for compassion, for vigilance, for remembrance, for heeding the better instincts of our nature. This cathedral is a house of prayer for all people of faiths and no faith. And as a result, we are committed to defending the human rights, the human dignity of all God's children, regardless of their nationality, their ethnicity, their race, gender, sexual orientation, you name it. My prayer is that the addition of Elie Wiesel makes that promise a little more real, a little more tangible in this space. My prayer is that his presence, carved in limestone for all time, makes us a better cathedral, and it will serve as a reminder for the ages. Never forget, never give up, never give in. Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Sara Bloomfield.
Thank you, Dean Hollerith, and good evening, everyone. This is, for me, a sad and joyous occasion to reflect on a person I was very blessed to know, a remarkable person, as we all know. With each passing year, we're learning more and more just how much words matter. Elie Wiesel's words really mattered. He is gone, but his words remain, and now it's up to us to make sure they inspire new generations, especially as history education is waning or contested. Elie's words were animated by his love of Judaism, his profound commitment to Jewish values and traditions, his devastating experiences of unspeakable loss, and his deep conviction that humanity's future could be, indeed must be, better than its past. His words created a memory movement and a memoir described by the New York Times as a slim volume of terrifying power that shaped many lives, including my own. They also created a memorial museum on the National Mall in the capital of the free world. Elie's words are in several places throughout our museum, but perhaps most importantly, our visitors encounter them when they first enter. Words he spoke on opening day when he said, "The museum is not an answer, it's a question." Elie challenged us to examine the Holocaust with relentless questioning. Why did it happen? Who was responsible? What could have been different? And perhaps most importantly, he wanted us to ask a question of ourselves. What are my responsibilities to humanity now that I know these horrible truths about humanity? In these challenging times with Holocaust denial, anti-Semitism, and racism on the rise, and when our public discourse and social solidarity are so frayed, I have repeatedly longed for Elie's words, and I'm sure I'm not alone. Who today inspires sufficient public trust so that we cannot just listen, but truly hear? Who has the eloquence and moral authority to summon us when we are off course and speak truth to power? Who reminds us of universal human dignity and makes sure that forgotten victims in faraway places get our attention? Who uses just the right words over and over again to shake us from our complacency, help us overcome our fears, and remind us of the demands of our own humanity? Who better exemplifies the Jewish concept of tikkun olam that calls on each of us to work continuously on repairing a very broken world? Today, the museum is very honored to participate with the National Cathedral, Dean Hollerith, and your wonderful staff, to honor this singular individual to whom the museum owes its very existence, and especially to share this moment with our close friends, Elie and Marian Wiesel. Thank you.
I say that
I belong to a traumatized generation that often felt abandoned by God and betrayed by mankind. And yet I believe that one must not estrange oneself from either God or man. Was it yesterday or eternities ago that some of us have realized that human beings are capable of unspeakable brutality? That for killers it was human to be inhuman? Are we therefore to give up on humanity? Was then the man that we are, the human beings that we are, were we God's victim or God's failure? Are we God's prisoner? Are we God's orphan?
One of Elie's great geniuses was to take his personal history, but to make it into a universal message for all of humanity, and to remind all of us of the fragility of all human societies, and that human beings always have this propensity towards hatred, but that there is something we can do about it.
I still cling to words, but it is we who decide whether they become spears or balm, carriers of bigotry or vehicles of understanding, whether they are used to curse or to heal, whether they are here to cause shame or to give comfort. I believe that ultimately it is we who decide whether words are to be turned into poisonous arrows or into peace offerings. I belong to a generation that has learned that whatever the question, despair is not an answer. Whatever the experience, indifference is not an option.
So he made his past a warning and an inspiration for the future by telling a story that was at once very particular to his experience and those of the others, Jews during the Holocaust, but also a very universal story about all of us as human beings.
Well, if you think about what he experienced as a young man, what he lived through in Auschwitz and Bloomfield, he would have had every right to spend the rest of his life seeking comfort and quiet. And yet, he didn't. He spent the rest of his life striving to make sure that what happened to him doesn't happen to others.
I believe that every day it is incumbent upon us to choose anew between deadly warfare among adults and the right of children to grow up without fear, with a smile on their face, between ugly hatred and the nobility of opposing it, between inflicting pain and humiliation and inventing a beginning of solidarity and hope.
I think that example is so incredibly powerful of the opposite of what apathy is, the opposite of what not caring is. And for so many of us who live quite comfortably in the Western world, we need his example. Even in the midst of our comfort, the worst thing we can do is be apathetic about the nature of the world around us.
I think that the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and the National Cathedral have in common a commitment to the dignity of all human beings, and that we must inspire and challenge all human beings to have responsibility for that human dignity and for promoting our shared humanity, and for doing what Elie always admonished us to beware of, which was indifference to the plight of our fellow human beings.
Much more, what we want to do is to remind everyone who comes in this building about the legacy that he leaves us, about the lessons that he stood for, about what he lived through and survived, so that one, we never forget the Holocaust, and that everyone who walks in this building and sees his face is reminded of that. And two, hopefully, we will be inspired to continue his work and his legacy.
I know, and I speak of experience, that even in the midst of darkness, it is possible to create light and share warmth with one another. That even on the edge of the abyss, it is possible to dream exalted dreams of compassion. That it is possible to be free and strengthen the ideals of freedom, even within prison walls. that even in exile, friendship becomes an anchor.
Elie managed to survive the Holocaust, one of the greatest crimes in human history, a crime that showed the ultimate depths of human evil and hatred. And yet he took that suffering and he converted it into a lesson for all of humanity. Few individuals have given us that extraordinary gift.
Why write memories? Why share experiences? For the dead, it is too late. We do all that because it is not too late for our children, for all children. It's never too late.
It's now my pleasure to introduce Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, Canon historian of this cathedral, and my friend, Jon Meacham. Please welcome Jon.
Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask thy father, and he will show thee, thy elders, and they will tell thee. So said Moses in his final song to the people of Israel. The long journey was nearly done. The promised land was in sight. The future was at hand. Yet the great prophet spoke not only of what was to come, but of what had been and what could be. Of what had been and what could be. In a similar spirit, we are gathered to engage in remembrance. Not remembrance in the sense of sentimentality, and least of all for nostalgia, but remembrance as an act of witness and as an act of agency. Let me be forthright. We stand in a cathedral of a religious tradition, my tradition, that failed to meet the crisis of the Holocaust in the capital city of a nation that also failed to meet that crisis. We mourn and we remember the millions of Jews who were killed because they were Jews. And we pray that what we do now, what each of us, bound by a common humanity, do now, will enable us to aid the cause of justice, the cause of love, and the cause of light. Elie Wiesel's was a particular life with universal implications. Universal lessons, universal power. As he always insisted in that quiet and unforgettable voice, he was but one part of a vast story. He was a Jew. He was a survivor. He was a writer. He was a witness who spoke up when he saw injustice and forever urged the rest of us to do the same. The cathedral's memorial to Elie Wiesel is not designed to elevate him above any other Holocaust victim or survivor. But monuments can help point the way for the rest of us. They are elements of the mechanics of memory. They are the means of remembrance. And as we know from the Hebrew Scriptures, we need protagonists, for stories are how we teach, how we learn, and how we remember. The architecture of this cathedral seeks to illuminate a path not only upward, but forward. Forward to a reality in which justice might roll down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. Forward to a reality in which, in the words of Leviticus, we love our neighbors as ourselves, and we do not stand idly by the blood of our neighbor. Forward to a world where love and kindness triumph over appetite and ambition. And this is, Lord knows, and we know, the most difficult of tasks. We know that. Elie Wiesel knew that. But he tried, and so must we. And we are arguably fortunate that we undertake this great and arduous and unending battle in the United States of America. This nation gets much wrong, and how could it not? Democracy is the sum of its parts, and the parts are people like me, the fallen and the sinful, the greedy and the selfish, the negligent and the self-satisfied. We should know better. We should do better. We must do better. But we often fail. And Elie Wiesel calls to us not because we are perfect, not even because we are good, but because we are human, and because we, like him, are American. Listen to him, who wrote this of his becoming a citizen of the United States. From that day on, I felt privileged to belong to a country which for centuries has stood as a living symbol of all that is charitable and decent to victims of injustice everywhere, a country in which every person is entitled to dream of happiness, peace, and liberty, where those who have are taught to give back, where those who have are taught to give back. Elie Wiesel often spoke of Thursday, April 11th, 1945, the day American troops arrived at Buchenwald. Hear his testimony. I remember them well. Bewildered, disbelieving, they walked around the place, hell on earth, where our destiny had been played out. They looked at us, just liberated, and did not know what to do or say. Survivors snatched from the dark throes of death, we were empty of all hope, too weak, too emaciated to hug them or even speak to them. Like lost children, the American soldiers wept and wept with rage and sadness, and we received their tears as if they were heart-rending offerings from a wounded and generous humanity. These are words of witness and of remarkable grace. For honesty compels us to note that the United States and its allies did not do all they could have done as darkness fell over Europe. The Christian Church should have universally stood against Nazi Germany, and not only stood, but acted. That did not happen. Broadly put, most Christians of the era, as well as the government of the United States, failed to say and to do what should have been said and done in the face of evil. Antisemitism, isolationism, nativism, and indifference were facts of life. They are facts of life. I judge not, nor do I mindlessly condemn the past. For the moral utility of history lies in its capacity to remind us of our duty to stand vigilant against and to take action against perennial and pernicious forces that lead to discrimination, to genocide, to hunger, oppression, and injustice. We are here tonight, you and I, to discuss how we might best equip ourselves for this work. And we're here to explore an unsettling and essential question. What do we do when acts of remembrance, when recollections of history reveal, as they so often do, not triumphs, but tragedies? This is what we do. We acknowledge the truth. We confront reality in all its anguish and complexity. We remember that we are called to close the gap between the profession of the ideals of equality, justice, and love, and the practice of those ideals. Elie Wiesel taught us this. He wrote, "No nation is composed of saints alone. None is sheltered from mistakes or misdeeds. All have their Cain and Abel. It takes vision and courage to undergo serious soul-searching and to favor moral conscience over political expedience. America is always ready to learn from its mishaps. Self-criticism remains its second nature. Self-criticism remains its second nature." Is that still true? That's partly what we are here to consider. I do know this: we must pray that America is ready to remember, ready to learn, and ready to act. Elie Wiesel remembered, he learned, and he acted. In our own time, we will fail, we will sin, we will fall. But when we do, we will look up from the dust, through the twilight, and see Elie Wiesel. And seeing him, we will remember, and we will rise, and we will follow his gaze forward to try to seek the light, no matter how deep the darkness. For that is what he would have us do. As our panel prepares to come forward, please take a moment to listen to these comments from the 64th Secretary of State of the United States, Madeleine Albright.
John, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to join this discussion about a man I truly revere. Elie Wiesel led an incomparable life and taught us so much about ourselves and the world. One of his greatest gifts was to empower us all with a basic choice. We can contemplate the Holocaust and despair, or we can remember the Holocaust and vow never again to allow complacency or fear to excuse inaction. We know which path Elie Wiesel chose, and it was not the path of despair. Consider his remarkable journey. After an early life that was shattered by an unbridgeable chasm of hate, he devoted the rest of his years to building bridges of understanding and mutual respect. He understood the dangers of ignorance and indifference, so he called on us not only to recognize evil whenever we see it, but also to fight hate whenever we confront it, and to remember that no one's blood is less precious than our own. From witnessing humanity at its very worst, Elie Wiesel came to embody humanity at its very best. He urged us to never forget the 6 million Jews who died, and he asked us to use their memory as a teaching about the need to speak truth and confront evil. He recognized the dangers of Holocaust denial because he knew what could happen when otherwise decent people fall under the spell of a big lie. That is why he led the effort to establish the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, a critical partner in tonight's program. And that is why it is so important that we are giving him this permanent place of honor in the Washington National Cathedral, a house of prayer for all people and a symbol of all that binds us together as a nation. Not long after September 11th, I was on a panel with Elie Wiesel, and he asked us to name the unhappiest character in the Bible. Some said Job because of the trials he endured. Some said Moses because he was denied entry to the Promised Land. Some said the Virgin Mary because she witnessed the crucifixion of her son. Wiesel said he believed the right answer was God because of the pain he must surely feel in seeing us fight, kill, and abuse each other in the Lord's name. The lesson he gave us that day is seared into my memory as a warning, one that must be on our minds today. We must never allow the distinctions that define us to obscure the common humanity that binds us. We must never allow pride in us to curdle into hatred of them. Heeding that warning is what every effort at Holocaust remembrance is all about. And it is a basic truth that we as a nation must rediscover if we are to thrive in the 21st century. Thank you so much for letting me say a few words in appreciation for one of humanity's greatest champions. May his memory continue to guide us for many decades to come.
Dr. Afridi, Ms. New, Rabbi Saperstein, thank you all for being here. My role at this point is like what Ronald Reagan used to say in Hollywood when someone would call and ask him if he would come to be at a charity event. He'd say, well, I can't sing or dance, why would you want me? And they would say, well, we know, but you can introduce someone who can. So I will just introduce you all and press forward. But Rabbi, I wanted to start with you, if I might. Talk a little bit, if you would, about how the history of the Holocaust and obviously Elie's work, legacy, shapes your work, and in particular your work when you served as Ambassador for Religious Liberty.
The effect that Elie Wiesel has had on so many who work for justice and freedom and peace across the globe is, of course, enormous. And as we heard over and over again, he took the lessons of this distinct tragedy of the Jewish people and applied its lesson to the world about him. So not just in terms of my work as an ambassador, but in every aspect of various causes I've been involved with. And he was a champion of human rights in some ways that most people are not even aware of here. But when he spoke in his Nobel speech, he said very clearly how naive we were. The world knew, but it remained silent. And that's why I swore I would never be silent whenever and wherever human beings suffer humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are in danger, human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race, their religion, or political views, that place must at that moment become the center of the universe. So he took that lesson on the causes that he and I worked together on here. We first worked together directly on nuclear disarmament. After Anthony Blinken's stepfather, Samuel Pizarro, spoke to the second gathering of Holocaust survivors, who was held in a world gathering in Jerusalem, and talked about how what happened in the Holocaust was a test run for the willingness with the political combined with technology to destroy the whole human race, and where, if not with those with the numbers inscribed in their arms, should warn against a nuclear annihilation of the world. Elie felt that passionately and would speak out about it. He challenged President Clinton at the dedication of the museum on being slow to respond to Bosnia and Kosovo and the genocidal activities that were happening. He championed the rights of the people in Darfur when they were subject to genocidal activity. He had spoken about Cambodia. He spoke against apartheid, and he spoke out against the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela. He spoke about indigenous Indian communities in Central America and their rights. And he saw all of those as being essential. So you take the lessons that he inspired in me, as I know he inspired in so many gathered here, and I become the ambassador of the United States dealing with issues of religious persecution across the globe. And I'm thinking, what would Elie say about it? And Here, Jews historically were the quintessential victims of religious persecution over the centuries, exiled, banished, persecuted, put into ghettos, victims of pogroms even before the Holocaust. And the lesson to me was clear. Just like Elie, I would have to speak out, and I would have to speak out on behalf of the Uyghur Muslims in China, subject to genocidal activity, the Rohingyas, subject to ethnic cleansing, the Shia Muslims in Bahrain or Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan, the Baha'is in Iran. All across the globe, there are victims of religious persecution. And we, who have been the quintessential victims as a Jew, I felt that I speak out, but America founded on the proposition, as Elie talks about so passionately, of freedom and democracy and equality. How could we possibly be silent as well? So Elie's voice was so often in my ears in the work that I did, and I think it has helped animate the lessons of the Holocaust Museum that he helped create, have animated to so many who have gone through it, the lessons that they take home as well on behalf of religious freedom.
Yeah. You mentioned his addressing President Clinton, also in one of the most remarkable moments, I think, in the history of the American presidency, in the Roosevelt Room in 1985, he directly, courageously, courteously, graciously challenged President Reagan. Would you talk a little bit about that?
He did. I think everyone will remember, most who are old enough will remember, and others may not have the context. President Reagan was going to Germany and was going to visit the Bitburg Cemetery, where a number of war heroes, Nazi war heroes, were buried. And the Jewish community was outraged. All those who cared about growing anti-Semitism in the world, the resurgence of anti-Semitism again, were deeply concerned about giving his stamp of approval by his attendance there. And at a time, I believe he was being awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom at the time, he turned to the president and with that wonderful voice that haunts all of us, inspires all of us, that he so gently says to him very simply, "Mr. President, that place is not your place. Your place is with the victims." And that's what his life was about, to take the lessons of the Holocaust when the world did not stand in the beginning as forcefully as it should have with the victims, beginning in 1933, here, and to say, never again should the world be silent when there are others are victims of hate and persecution.
Give us just a moment. Rabbi Greenberg is going to come in virtually for us to talk about the legacy, but introduce Rabbi Greenberg, if you would.
Well, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who we're going to see on the tape, is an extraordinary figure, very close friend and co-worker with Elie Wiesel. The two of them were champions in what evolved into the Holocaust Museum. And he is an Orthodox rabbi who was a visionary theologian, institution builder, who really was ahead of his times in calling for greater gender roles for women. His wife is the founder of the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, an extraordinary organization here. And Yitz Greenberg is really admired across the board by Jews, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Modern Orthodox, that he was part of, and more traditional Orthodox, and a fitting pair and partner to the remarkable Elie Wiesel.
And the question that was posed to Rabbi Greenberg was, in light of the painful and difficult history of anti-Semitism in the church, why were interfaith relations so important to Elie Wiesel? Rabbi Greenberg.
I start by saying that the Nazis were the perpetrators of the Holocaust. They and their collaborators take full responsibility, or should be taken full responsibility, and no exculpation by anybody else. That having been said, it is now recognized that the Nazis exploited, you might say, the entrenched stereotypes and evil images of Jews and Judaism in order to select the Jews as the victims and the scapegoats. the Holocaust. And that, in turn, was implanted in the culture in many ways, but certainly in an important way by the Christian tradition of teaching of contempt. In other words, in trying to explain away Judaism and Jewish people, they said not merely criticism, but that the Jews were children of the devil, synagogue of Satan, or demonic ideas such as Jews taking the blood of Christian children, making it into the sacred. Now, Elie, therefore, in a sense, joined the dialogue because he wanted to get Christians to stop this tradition, to end this tradition of contempt. He wanted them to not be the purveyors of stereotype, conspiracy theory, and hatred. He was never speaking out of anger or revenge or victim rage. He just wanted to bring this faith and this religion into a new and loving relationship with Judaism and with the world. Now, as he deepened his connection and as he became more involved, frankly, as Christians invited him more and more, he came to understand the power, the significance, the beauty of Christianity in a way he never had as a sheltered Hasidic child in Hungary. And I believe by the end, he was very much driven by a simple thing, wanting to help Christianity be the gospel of love that it wants to be. I was always also very moved by the incredible Christian response to Elie, and in fact, more important, the incredible Christian repentance after the Holocaust and the transformation of the teaching about Judaism to affirmation of love. And to do this, Christians had to repent and go against very powerful forces, yet they had the intellectual courage and the spiritual strength to make that repentance. And by the way, I'm therefore particularly grateful to the Washington Cathedral for this act of adding Elie's bust to the gallery of heroes of human rights, which he is and which he deserves. But it's another way of expressing the new regard and the new partnership between us.
Dr. Fried, you have a remarkable path. You are a practicing Muslim engaged in the study of the Holocaust at a Catholic college. And there's one parachute. And it sounds like the beginning of a joke. Talk about that path and why and how Elie Wiesel's legacy is important to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, John. Before I answer that question, I really want to thank Dean Hollerith, Michelle Dibley, where is she? She's amazing. Jon Meacham, Sara Bloomfield, my friend always, and the Wiesel Foundation, and of course the DC Holocaust Museum, who I've been connected with for a very long time. I just want to start with exactly the fact that here I am as a Muslim woman sitting here directing a Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at a Catholic college in Riverdale, New York. But for me, as Wiesel would say, this is a moment of gratitude and grace. He said that for him, every hour is grace. And he said that I feel gratitude in my heart each time I can meet someone and look at his or her smile. And I think one of the things that I heard tonight already is that we have made some changes here. My sister, Wei here, is a Rohingya Muslim woman. I am a Pakistani Muslim woman. My field of studies and expertise is Islam and the Holocaust. That has changed. So I want us to recognize that, and this is exactly why I have chosen the path of fighting against anti-Semitism, fighting against Islamophobia, fighting against hate. It is a very, very tough time and a challenging role that I play, but I cannot tell you how many amazing people I have met in my life. Because the people that I meet, that I work with, the students that I teach, are hungry. They're hungry for peace and love and transformation. My childhood was full of integration, tension, rejection, and action. A Muslim girl in Europe at that time in the 80s and 90s was not so welcome. I was sitting with Jews and Hindus having my lunches. And then moving to the Middle East and ending up in New York, many experiences shaped me. I experienced how people were anti-Semitic. I experienced Islamophobia, and I became curious. And curiosity can lead to a path that is unimaginable. I also have chosen this path, John, because I think that in my own community, there is a lot of Holocaust relativization and denial and anti-Semitism. And according to my Islamic principles, and according to any faith, this is wrong. And the truth must be spoken. And that led to my work, Shoah Through Muslim Eyes, where I wanted to be the first Muslim to write a book, interview survivors, and state the facts about the Holocaust, state the facts about anti-Semitism, talk about the colonial past for Muslims and Arabs. And I just want to move on for you, but I also think that sometimes we forget how we remember. Sometimes we forget how we remember. We think we remember, but there are many parts of how and what and why we remember. And to me, that is essential in teaching, in being a human being, in telling stories to my children, and to being with you. And what Wiesel said was, without memory, there is no culture. He said, without memory, there will be no civilization, no society, and no future. So I want the memory of the Holocaust to be remembered in the Muslim, Arab, Asian, African world. I want to expand the memory of Holocaust education. And this is precisely why I do what I do.
And are your students, what do you find they know when they first crossed your path? What are they bringing to the enterprise?
I mean, I think one of the things that we have all learned, those of us that work in human rights, or our teachers, professors, academics, nonprofit, is that the question for us to be always in the center is, how are we going to have the student ask the right question? That is the most important thing. For me to stand up and to lecture about Islam or the Holocaust, or Muslims in America, or memory and Islamic literature, or Muslims in the Holocaust, which is a class I actually teach, religion and the Holocaust, is not enough. But how is this relevant to you today? What are the lessons you can apply to your life? Whether it's about racial discrimination, gender discrimination, sexual orientation discrimination. What is it emotionally you connect with a testimony from Tunisia, with a testimony from Greece? What do you have in common with this testimony? So I think bringing the personal and the curiosity of using different materials and different pedagogies is how you make the student ask the question, so you know what they want to learn. And that's what I want my students to take from me.
Ms. New, you are part of an unfolding story on exactly these grounds. You're a member of a Burma minority of being persecuted. Would you talk about your story and where the situation more broadly stands today?
Thank you, John. And thank you, the Cathedral and the Holocaust Memorial Museum, for highlighting this issue and for standing up for our people and persecuted minorities, religious communities across the world. And thank you for bringing the contemporary issue on this table. Today, it's been so inspiring to hear the late Elie Wiesel words and his legacy and his work and commitment, and I'm inspired by all the speeches and words that you guys have been discussing today. For me, I feel like I know very little about Holocaust, and it was the first time I've been to the Holocaust Memorial Museum it was in early 2014. I was in the museum and I was basically, really, really hungry to understand all of these stories and all of the events and processes that happened to the people in those days. And I can feel everything in that moment. And a lot of those experiences are the experiences that I grew up to now. And I can relate them. I can feel in that moment. I cried and cried. Basically, my entire life has been, I witnessed from being a citizen to becoming outsiders. And I witnessed all the suffering of my people and my people from the young age to up to today. And with the frustration that I can do nothing, and feel like abandoned in this world. We're seeing horrific atrocity crimes happening, but we can't do anything, and felt like nobody's speaking for us. So as I grew up, as I was explaining, we were once citizens, and even it was not long ago, 30 years ago, my parents were able to go to the schools and universities, and they were able to work with the governments, and they had equal rights as other people. But today, our young people can no longer go to the school, or people are struggling to have even access to healthcare, access to basic health, or access to food and nutrition, access to employment opportunities. And while facing so many forms of restrictions on their freedom, including limitations or restrictions against the access to, restrictions against their freedom, with the many checkpoints in their own villages and in their cities. So basically, the Rohingya, where majority of us are living in northern part of Rakhine State, which is the western part of quite complicated, I guess, western part of Burma. And in that state, our people have been confined for several decades now. And recently, in 2016 and 17, the Burmese military conducted operations called clearance operations, where the people are subjected to many brutal activities, including killing, mass rape, mutilations, burning 2/3 of the Rohingya villages, and forcing about 900,000 people from their home with barefoot to Bangladesh. Now, these populations, about 1 million people, are living in one of the largest refugee camps in Bangladesh. And now it's been 4 years, there is no justice, there is no, the people are just wait for justice and accountability, while the remaining Rohingya in Rakhine State, about 600,000 people, are living under these genocidal policies, facing many forms of apartheid, and with the confinement, with, again, continuations of these genocidal policies, with limited access to healthcare, food, nutrition, and educations, economic activities, as well as limiting their ability to marry, to get birth, to give birth, and many other forms. And once we were citizens, now we become non-citizens. Once people were able to, for instance, my father was an elected parliamentarian, but now our people cannot even vote, and that's how it's changed in my entire life. The United Nations fact-finding missions reports came out in 2018. It described the situations about the Rohingya as, in the report, it says they found the violence that occurred against the Rohingyas are elements of the genocides and crimes against humanity. Yet, it's ongoing today as I speak, but there is no action has been taken. So I truly appreciate the Holocaust Memorial Museum for standing up for our people, and I wish that these discussions will lead to a greater actions by the United States government. And I don't want to feel anymore that, you know, in 1930s, where the U.S. government did not support did not provide the protection to the Jewish community because they were too fearful of losing allies, German allies, or disappointing German people. And I don't want to see these situations happening in Burma or elsewhere. I hope that these discussions will lead to some greater push towards the U.S. government.
Thank you. Thank you. Rabbi, so here we have an unfolding example. I'm a big believer that the best way to teach is by story and case study. Obviously, Elie's work with Soviet Jewry is a terrific example. I want you to talk a little bit about that, but also take us to America today as well. And are there forces in the land that give you pause and then incite you to action?
Yeah. The Soviet Jewry issue was particularly important to him. And again, if I could go back to that extraordinary Nobel Prize speech, he said in it, "I am a Jew profoundly rooted in my people's memory and tradition. My first response is to Jewish fears, Jewish needs, Jewish crises. I belong to a traumatized generation, one that experienced, as you just described, the abandonment and solitude of our people. It would be unnatural for me not to make Jewish priorities my own, Israel, Soviet Jewry, Jews in Arab lands." So he cared deeply about those things. This also was of personal meaning to me because my father was a prominent rabbi, and my parents had traveled to the Soviet Union and came back speaking out against Soviet Jews in 1959, 1961, and 1967. And the first couple of times they would come back and speak out, they were criticized. The Israelis are trying to handle this behind the scenes. You shouldn't speak out about it here. And they would speak out. And then Elie Wiesel writes before their last trip, the Jews are silenced, talking about both those Jews who were the victims of cultural genocide in the Soviet Union, but also the Jews of the world, particularly America, who were indifferent and apathetic about the suffering in the same way too often the world can be to a suffering that we can make a difference in, and we're too late over and over again in terms of this. So he dedicated himself to being a voice on behalf of Soviet Jewry, as he was also with Israel. And yet, with Israel, it's interesting to note, he saw it as the fulfillment of the historic 3,000-year-old dream of the Jewish people and a safe refuge that Jews would never again be victimized by a Holocaust. And yet, in his Nobel speech, he speaks out about the suffering and the plight of the Palestinians also here. Again, he universalizes the lessons that come from what he has. So he believed in America to be the voice that you are asking for here. And I'm proud of the entire religious freedom enterprise in which the United States leads the world in speaking out about religious repression. And during my tenure, we counted up at the end, there were 52 public speeches I gave where I warned about what was happening to the Rohingya, even then, before the ethnic cleansing of 1 million people took place. And having visited the community there and having visited now twice the camps, I can only affirm everything you said. It is simply heartbreaking. A woman who saw her daughter raped in front of her face. Here, another woman who had a baby taken from her and thrown in a fire. Here, the imams, they're not called imams there, but the people who function as imams here, who would be killed and their Quran destroyed, and the small huts that served as the gathering place for prayer, a mosque there, destroyed. This is an effort to eviscerate the presence on that land of someone. And time and again, the Holocaust Museum, and Sara Bloomfield is here and a co-sponsor of this, here has been a voice in that commission on a council on conscience that it has been a warning bell to the world about these things. That's carrying on Elie's vision. That's one of the reasons he wanted the Holocaust Museum. So the Soviet Jewry issue also is absolutely crucial to us today, because it tells us we can make a difference. Here, it put together, led to the Helsinki process, it led to the champion of the cause all across the globe, Jews and non-Jews speaking out, identifying with people. Today, Jon, you have written so extraordinarily about America and what has made America great in the past and how it's overcome its challenges. I think that Elie Wiesel would be heartbroken to see the divisiveness, the anger, the hatred that permeates the internet, that permeates now our civic discourse in America, here, the rise in hate crimes. Because remember, hate crimes are an attack on everything America is about. The purpose of hate crimes is to tear America apart, to divide us about it. And he spoke out about hate crimes everywhere. In Cambodia, in South Africa, in South America, here, everywhere that they occurred. I think he would be talking today about, again, this is a failure to learn the most important lesson of the Holocaust, that hatred against people and the willingness to aim at their destruction, whether we're talking about their political destruction, cultural destruction, physical destruction, is the antithesis for what God wants and calls us to here. And he would be a powerful voice for healing, the healing that America so desperately needs now.
Where's the line between suasion and attention and action? To speak out is a vital first step. Words matter. You cannot solve a problem you are not aware of. But I'm wondering, particularly if you're a student and you hear that people denounce genocide, they denounce hate. Okay, we can get behind that. But there is a next step. It's not just attention, it is agency. And I'm wondering how students see that. And then, David, you've been part of the government. I hate to bring that up, but but you know how these institutions work and don't work. So I'm just curious, how do students think that, well, if you talk about a problem enough, that's a good thing, or is there a cynicism about that?
That's a really good question, because I think it's something that students struggle with in terms of action, healing, repairing, doing something, and something I think teachers struggle with. But I think one of the ways when you're teaching genocide, and I teach the Rohingya, and I've been teaching also the Uyghur genocide, because it is happening right now, and we're watching it, and we have images of it, and we have evidence of it. And one of my students the other day asked me, why aren't we doing anything about the Uyghurs? And I'm from Pakistan, so I know why Pakistan's not doing anything. It's an economic reason. And my Prime Minister, Imran Khan, was pretty open about it and transparent about it. I don't agree with that. But so we get caught up in sort of this economic wall, but denial, and become paralyzed. But what you can do for students, and what I've done in the past, is majority of my students are Catholic, secular, growing Muslim population on our campus, and I'm their advisor. And I know there are Jews on campus, but they're not very visible. And there are Buddhists and Hindus and etc. But majority is Catholic. So a lot of my Catholic students have not been to a synagogue, ever. They've never been to a mosque. They really haven't learned much about Judaism or Islam. And I remember there was vandalism in Riverdale against synagogues. And I'm just going to reveal this, but I created a GoFund to pay for all the windows and the doors in our neighborhood. And I gave each synagogue, there were 4, money for their windows and doors. And, you know, my students were part of that. So, I mean, I think, why was that important? And actually, it was really important because horribly, at that point, the Israeli-Gaza incursion was going on. And I said to the rabbis that this act was even more important now, during this moment. And my students really learned something because they understood that it's very important to speak up for another. Mm-hmm. It's not just about me being victimized, but it's about other victimization. As soon as you only talk about your victimization, you're actually giving into victimizing the other. Because what you're doing is you're trying to look at yourself as you're just the only victim, and you lose the voices. And so what I try to teach my students is that even if you're Catholic or Muslim or whatever, you need to stand by our community. You need to go to that synagogue and show your support. And they felt very active when they did that. They feel different when they walk into a synagogue. So these are different action items. They're not changing the world. I mean, they have signed petitions and done all the activism work with me, but they're not going to go to Burma. They're not going to go to China, but at least they're aware. And what are those lessons teaching them? Those lessons are teaching them that if we continue prejudice, if we continue this vitriolic hate, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, black racism, then look what can happen, right? So there is this kind of momentous idea that Holocaust education, genocide education, is more relevant than we can ever imagine today because of the lessons we can draw from there.
So I live in Tennessee, and I got the one vaccination we had, so y'all don't worry. Tragically, sort of true. And my 13-year-old asked me where I was going. And I said I was coming to the cathedral to take part in something about Elie Wiesel. And she lit up because she's read Night. I've only had that reaction from her on one other occasion. And that was when I told her we were going to Selma to be with John Lewis. And I say that because, and if I'd said I was going to see, Gorbachev, she would have said, is that Russian food? I mean, it wouldn't have cared at all. But Wiesel, Lewis, there is a power in those stories that I think Night is arguably the most influential book of the second half of the 20th century into the 21st. And works of witness, like the witness you bear, form the infrastructure of any kind of moral and social recovery. And I'm wondering about how one keeps those stories vibrant and alive as time goes by. And is that something when you talk about Burma, do you think about the issues involved in making sure that the witness you're bearing remains vivid and moving?
So, in the case of Burma, especially in particular the Rohingya, it's extremely difficult to stand up for themselves because we have been made to be so vulnerable to the point that we don't even know how to talk to people. And for me, witnessing that itself hurt a lot. And I could never imagine things would become like this when I was younger. So, but then it was when I was released from the jail and I had so much knowledge of the political systems in the country, being in this jail and talking to so many other political prisoners and reading lots of books, I was able to see the bigger picture. And when I was released from the jail, the Burmese military's, Burmese government's genocidal campaign against the Rohingya has escalated. So that's where I started to see when my people not many people among my community to stand up for themselves, and up to today. So that's why we need a lot of help from the other communities and around the world. For me, realizing that, seeing that, I stood up and I started to take actions to respond to the situations in Rakhine State against my people, or to fight for freedom and dignity and justice for all people in Myanmar, because it is not just that Rohingya are subjected to genocidal campaign, but also there are many other ethnic and religious minorities in Myanmar who are targeted for many other forms of discriminations and persecutions under the decades-long authoritarianism. So that's how I stood up. But now, the horrific, brutal acts against the Rohingya happened in 2016 and 2017, and it's continued to happen. But there are very little effort from the community side that has been able to keep the memories and keep the witness memories alive and vivid, as well as take actions to fight for their own rights, or to promote their own, to protect their own human dignity, not only in Burma, but also elsewhere where they become refugees in Bangladesh or elsewhere. So, and they continue to suffer from many forms of discriminations because there is no protections mechanisms available around the world for them, and they continue to suffer from the discriminations whether in Bangladesh or in Malaysia or in India or everywhere else. They are trying to escaping from genocide and finding a safe haven elsewhere. So at this point it is hard, and that's why I think it is so important to bring the discussions here and to equip this community to be able to stand up for themselves and to work on their own futures and to keep the memories and to seek for the justice. And one thing about the actions I want to bring up here, I think there are many types or many ways that people can take actions. One has, one individuals like Elie Wiesel can take this bigger actions, and every one of you can take so many actions. It just needs, the commitment and dedication to take actions for those who need your help. And I believe in that. That's how I came to take on my own actions. But one thing that I just want to remind is that it is very critical and important to understand the situations deeply and to listen to the victim communities and take their words and their solutions seriously. Oftentimes people dismiss the work of the victim communities or the knowledge of the victim communities. That's how we are not able to find solutions for many crises around the world. So yes, we need actions, but it is important to ensure that it's in line with the need and the context and the demand from the communities on the ground. Thank you.
That's great.
You know, there is a whole range of actions governments can take in their economic, military, security, cultural, social exchanges, political exchanges with other nations that create incentives for change, and sanctions and penalties when change is being resisted. Here. And individually, there's a whole range of things we can do. We heard a litany of a lot of good ideas. I would add to that, just in terms of your question about America, when mosque was arsoned in Texas, our synagogue opened its doors to them. Muslim groups have cleaned up Jewish cemeteries that were desecrated. Communities rallied with each other when an African-American church in South Carolina is attacked, and when Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh is attacked, standing against the haters, making sure the rule of law will work, but then trying to change the communities. And we can do a lot in education. If every church in America, if every synagogue in America, and mosque in America held events this year educating not just their members, but the broader community, like you're doing here now, about the Rohingya plight of the Rohingya, about the Rohingya plight of the Uyghurs, it would create momentum. And then there's legislative acts that we have in Congress that can really make a difference. I'm really proud of the fact, I don't know how many of you actually know this, that a lot of us working together were able to get through on January 14th, 2019, the Elie Wiesel Atrocities Prevention Act that was aimed at adding power and heft to our efforts to really identify, you know, when we're going to educate about Holocaust, it isn't just in 1939 to 1945. It begins in 1933, even earlier, with the racialism, the pseudoscientific racialism on which it was based. But it was, how do we get from 33 to 39? That's where the real lessons for America and the countries are across the world. So there's a lot that we really can do on these issues. And as Elie Wiesel would say, we're not the prisoners of a bitter and unremitting past. We can be, we must be, we will be the shapers of a better and more hopeful future.
So a final lightning round. Elie Wiesel's lessons for the 21st century. What do you think?
I think everyone can be Elie Wiesel. And we have to keep the spirit and his legacy, and so that we can prevent more people from facing persecutions and genocide. I mean, the governments came together promising never again, but they continue to ignore the suffering of the people around the world. And it is the individuals and citizens and taxpayers like you to hold your governments accountable to keep their promises and to prevent and protect vulnerable populations across the world.
Thank you. Doctor?
Yeah, I mean, a lot comes to mind, but I just want to say as a religious studies scholar that Elie Wiesel has taught us that religious discrimination can truly lead to murder in the modern times. I'm a Muslim and I have a lot of affinity with Judaism. There are a lot of commonalities that we have. And I think that Elie Wiesel's faith, loss of faith, and regaining of faith is something very important for the human spirit. whether you're a believer or not, but I mean faith. So when you are, and I cannot imagine ever what Elie Wiesel experienced, but when you read Elie Wiesel or you hear him talk, and you say, wow, okay, he lost faith. God was hanging from the gallows, but then he regained faith. So to me, what I guess my lesson for 21st century, and not just 21st, maybe it's endless, eternal, I don't know how to put it, but as a Muslim, I think you have...
One step at a time.
Yeah, it could be the whole thing, but you know, I think one of the lessons that I feel is really important is not to lose faith. And if you do, then there will be someone that you will pass by that will make you believe in something that is really important, like faith. And I mean faith, not in the religious sense. But I think that's the lesson that I want to also impart to my students because of today's climate. The loneliness, the sort of self-referential medium that we live in, the lack of language, the lack of touching because of COVID, but because of our tablets, our phones, our TVs. So I think faith is so important to our children in the future, and faith in themselves. And I think we need to tell them that they can trust us, and that we don't always have to trust them. And I think that is something that Elie Wiesel has really taught me.
I'm going to give Rabbi Saperstein the last word, but Rabbi Greenberg is going to come to us to answer this question.
I'd like to suggest 4 outstanding lessons that Elie's work and life taught all of us and that he expressed in all his teaching. One is that the experience of victimization is never the final step. It's our choice, but we should take it and turn it around into a spur for the constructive and life-giving activity. Yeah. In 4 ways. One is you don't give in to evil and never be a bystander. When people are in danger, when nations are oppressed, when individual groups are being threatened and oppressed, do not be a bystander. He always stressed the fact that bystanding always helps the evil one, the perpetrator, and not the victim. If you look at the record of the Holocaust, 6 million were killed. But in the countries where there were not collaboration, where there was strong support for Jews, such as Denmark, 95% were saved, or Bulgaria, where the Bulgarian Jews were saved. In short, the collaboration or resistance of the bystanders is what made the difference in Jewish survival. Second crucial teaching of Elie, life and not death gets the last word if we make the right choice. That's in our hands, that life have the last word. So we have to rebuild after destruction, not to crumble, not to give up. He had the courage to come over and start another family, have a child, and a firm reliving of life. Most of the time he spent, again, not speaking about the destruction, but in teaching and in recreating life, recreating Jewish life. Thirdly, speaking truth to power. That, of course, is an expression of conscience and of inner strength and inner greatness. But it's a remarkable quality that he showed. And I want to say, when I say speaking truth to power, not just human power. One of his great lessons for all of us in religion, he's a man of deep faith who wrestled with God continually and spoke truth to God, expressed the complaint and the anxiety and the disappointment of humanity that God did not save us from the Holocaust or from the other evils that exist in this world. And he taught us all that you can have a profound relationship to God and to faith, and that is side by side with arguing with God, or doubt, or experiencing the absence. One has to speak with truth and integrity, even to God. And that speaking of truth enabled a reconnection to God at the same time. Of course, he did the exact same thing here on Earth, you might say, in warning President Reagan against going to Bitburg, not identifying or honoring the SS and their murderers, or when he spoke at the dedication of the museum and asked President Clinton to intervene to end the genocide in Bosnia. Again, there was tremendous pressure not to speak, but his conscience and his commitment and his embrace of humanity led him to speak truth. And lastly, I identify, and think we all want to follow him in his tremendous teaching of memory. He made the world remember that never to forget the victims, but also never to forget the life that they lived, the worlds that they created, the goodness and the culture that they represented. And he said, if we forget, we hand evil, the perpetrators, yet another victory. In the Song of Songs, we are told in the Bible, love is stronger than death. Memory is the expression of love, that love that does not end with the death of the other. And that love is more powerful. That love links all humans to each other. And that means that memory is the key to love, which is the key to the continuing power and blessing of life.
Rabbi Saperstein.
So we have talked about Elie Wiesel's extraordinary gifts that led to his being honored in the Hall of Human Rights Heroes. We've not talked about other aspects of this remarkable person. His literature, that he was talked about as a possible Nobel laureate recipient for literature, is as well here. His gifts as a teacher and passion as a teacher, his years at Boston University, but also his speeches all over the world. His regular lectures he gave for decades at the 92nd Street Y, probing the Bible and all of the legends around stories and the interpretations over the centuries, combining it with his knowledge of Hasidic Judaism and aspects of mysticism, bringing it alive to us today. These were tremendous gifts. So let me just make my final comment about the most famous story, I think, that Elie Wiesel has ever written, and you alluded to it, the story in Night of the young boy who was hung before the camp, but too light. He hovered to break his neck. He hovered between life and death, and they were forced to look him in the face to march across, each one looking him in the face. And Elie Wiesel writes, when I got there, his tongue was not yet glazed. His eyes were not yet glazed. His tongue was still red. And I looked, and as I looked into his face, I heard the voice of someone behind me ask, where is God now, that this could happen? And I heard a voice within me answer, here is God. He is hanging on the gallows. So where is God for you today? For me, she is a victim of forced sterilization with 1 million Uyghurs who are in concentration camps. He's fleeing for his life from the oppression of extreme Buddhists and Myanmar military that ethnically cleansed there. For me, she is growing up to frustration and despair in our inner cities of America, out of school, out of jobs, out of hope, victims of racial injustice. For me, he is with millions of children who die of starvation-related causes, all of it preventable today, still in the world where we have the capacity to feed every child on earth, every human being on earth, and a failure to do it is a failure of moral will and political vision. That's where God is now. But Elie Wiesel, if he were here, would say, every time that you feed a hungry child, your hands are the hands of God, and you make God live on earth. And when you march for the Rohingya, the Uyghurs, or for any who are subject to injustice or persecution, then your feet are God's feet here on earth. And when you speak out for justice and peace, then your voice is God's voice here on earth. That is Elie Wiesel's lesson to me. And I say to you that it has never been needed more in the history of the world than it is at this moment, because the tragedy of the Holocaust today has the potential to destroy the human race through global warming, through nuclear war, through biological and chemical weapons. Here, it really is possible today. And Elie Wiesel says, as I said before, we're not victims. We can build that better world. And we make his memory be for a blessing every time we strive to create and build the world our children so richly deserve.
Amen. Thank you all. That was great.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you. Honored. That was fabulous.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you. You guys are great. Thank you so much.
My thanks to Jon Meacham and our incredible panel this evening. Thank you all for giving us such gifts. As we close this evening, it is only fitting and appropriate that we end tonight by hearing from a Wiesel. And so I am very proud to introduce to you this evening the son of Elie Wiesel, Elisha Wiesel. Welcome, please.
Dean Hollerith, Michelle, the incredibly warm staff here at the National Cathedral. Not only did you show my father the most profound respect by choosing to include him here for all time, but you were more than supportive. You were passionate about recognizing him in today's unveiling as the observant Jew he was. You went so far as to, at our request, introduce a blemish into the stonework to address the biblical injunction against graven images. Your flexibility, your compassion, your hospitality have made me very, very proud to know you. Our family and I are as moved by as we are grateful for all that you have done. I want to tell something to the people gathered here today. If I say anything that offends or is controversial or that you disagree with or that makes you uncomfortable, please know that these words are my own. They do not reflect the National Cathedral. They are amazing people, and they have spoken about what moved them to honor my father in this incredible panel that they convened, and in the words you just heard. My father's unbelievable passion for justice, regardless of skin color or gender identity or nationality, my father's belief in a better future for everyone is what inspired the cathedral. I'm here to fill in some other pieces that I believe are important for my father's legacy. Dear Dad, sometimes I think about just what you had to cross for me to be here, for me to be who I am today. After surviving the night that consumed our family, you felt the world no longer deserved Jewish children. I exist because you refused to give up on the world. I exist because you refused to give up on our family. You spoke to your ancestors often. I saw you. You spoke to the ones you loved. You remembered the ones you knew by name. And you dreamed of the ones you could not name and the ones you didn't know existed. Unknown ancestors line the branches of our family tree, but you knew where the chain resolved again on the other side. Levi, the son of Yaakov, Jacob, the son of Yitzchak, Isaac, the son of Abraham. You wandered back often through this chain, sometimes exploring, sometimes just being pulled by the texts through which our ancestors spoke to us and each other. You knew nobody could speak for the dead, but they were with you when you spoke, and they were with you when you wrote. They were with you because you took them with you. I know you're with me here today. How can I remind the world of who you were, of how you saw yourself? What must the world know about you that only I can tell them? Today, you were recognized as a universal figure speaking universal truths, accepted by a secular world. And thank God for that. But you were also an observant Jew who davened or prayed with intent and without fail every single day. Your faith helped define you. Today, you're recognized for speaking out against silence. But sometimes I see people quote your admonition against silence as an excuse to scream at others with contempt, self-righteousness, and anger. You never humiliated, ridiculed, or screamed. But what's hardest for me is seeing those who read your books, cry for the dead Jews, quote your protests against injustice, and then condemn in the most unforgiving terms the 6 million Jews living in Israel who refuse to ever again depend on the world to rescue them. No longer stateless and defenseless, these Jews, my brothers and sisters, face difficult circumstances and sometimes impossible choices. For this, they are held to a different standard than any other nation on earth by America's elite. How do I remind the world that you didn't just advocate for the people of Kosovo and Darfur and Cambodia, but that you also supported the state of Israel and defended her right to exist in peace and security? You understood all too well what it meant to live in a world without a Jewish state. Today you are being honored as a friend of the church, and I must review some uncomfortable truths. As a child, you would cross the street to avoid the church in town, to avoid beatings from those within. On Christmas Eve, you knew to stay off the streets altogether. Your grandmother sang you songs, my great-grandmother sang you songs about Jewish communities falsely accused of and decimated for poisoning wells or murdering Christian children to make matzah with their blood. How do I help our Christian friends understand that the Jewish people are still subject to libel, to blood libels today? Reactionary pastors here in America teach via YouTube that by supporting immigrants and people of color, Jews are poisoning the wells of white America. They hate us because your wife, my mother, arrived here from war-torn Europe and marched with the NAACP. They hate us because you, Dad, you asked, how can a human being be illegal? And American right-wing extremists shoot us with assault rifles in synagogues. Meanwhile, the left throws the word apartheid at Israel, ignoring the fact that thousands of Arabs voluntarily serve in the Israeli Defense Forces and swear their oaths on Qurans and New Testaments, ignoring the fact that an Arab political party was the kingmaker in forming this most recent Israeli government. Celebrities weigh in, accusing Israel of ethnic cleansing ignoring that the Palestinian population in Israel has grown by a factor of 9 since 1948. Instead, it is almost every state in the Arab Middle East that is Judenrein, cleansed of Jews, ethnically cleansed. And last summer, left-wing extremists spread lies that Israel was complicit in training George Floyd's murderers. And the United Church of Christ Synod condemned Israel in vitriolic terms without a trace of compassion for the Israeli people facing violence and terror. They never once mentioned Hamas. Angry mobs in Los Angeles and New York trashed restaurants, cursing F Israel, F the Jews, searching for Jews to violently attack. Why must our people stand accused of blood libel generation after generation, day after day? You taught us that language matters and truth matters, but we have grown lazy with language and lazy with the truth. And our enemies pervert and cheapen the most consequential words just to attack us. All suffering is now painted with the same brush. Reductive thinking has become the enemy of compassion. How do I get well-intentioned people to recognize that if they find themselves in any movement that tolerates lies and hatred towards the world's only Jewish state, that unless they can challenge and remove the anti-Semitic poison, that place is not their place? How do I tell them it is possible to be pro-Palestinian without being anti-Israel? Your generation, Dad, was blessed with the gift of great Christian allies, like the American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr and the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. They rejected the anti-Israel sentiment that threatened to poison their movements towards peace. Perhaps our next generation of allies will come from those who walk through the doors of the National Cathedral, look up to your likeness, and are inspired to ask questions about your presence in this church. It gives me a reason to hope, as do you. If you were betrayed by the world and could still engage with it, then surely I can as well. If you face total devastation and could still have a relationship with God, then surely I can as well. In 2006, you and King Abdullah of Jordan brought Mahmoud Abbas and Ehud Olmert together in the interest of peace, the Palestinian and Israeli prime ministers. It must have caused you pain to break bread with Minister Abbas, someone who began his career publishing many vile lies about the Holocaust, but you kept your counsel. If you could bear insult to the deepest of wounds and still resist anger and hatred, then I can too. Peace at that moment, it must have felt as unlikely as the coming of the Mashiach, the Messiah. But it did not stop you from believing, and it did not stop you from trying. You never stop trying, so neither can we.
My friends, thank you for being with us tonight. It has indeed been a powerful evening of learning and thinking, of seeing life from a number of different points of view, and from honoring the most wonderful of human beings, Elie Wiesel. So I'm grateful for you being with us. Now, may the Lord We have one more video. My apologies. Thank you, Michelle. Forgive me, my friends, the night would not have been complete without that powerful video. Now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you peace. Thank you and good night.